everyone, I am Rebecca from ChemKnits, and today we are going to play with resist dyeing yarn to create a monochromatic tonal colorway. And specifically, we're going to dye twisted skeins of yarn and then untwist and over dye it to create, again, this monochromatic yarn that has more saturated and less saturated versions of the same color. Normally, when we dye twisted skeins, we get something that has high contrast because the dye will really bind to the outside of the yarn, leaving a lot of areas undyed. And we can create fun colorways by layering the colors multiple times. There's a lot of techniques I do with this. But if we take one of these high contrast yarns and over dye it with the same color, you're still going to have some contrast in there, but you're going to reduce the contrast overall because there's not going to be the color and the white. You're going to see a lighter version of, in those examples, maybe like the blue, and then a deeper version of the blue. Now, I did try this once. I used some leftover dyes mixed with citric acid to create an orange. And when I untwisted it, the orange that I used, which was Paradise Fibers orange, actually went into the yarn a lot already. And so then when I added it back into the dye bath and added more color, we already had a lower contrast situation there. And so it was one of those situations where I wanted to do a demonstration. The demonstration did not work as I had planned, but I still got the result that I wanted. So I want to redo this and do something with a little more planning. I'm going to specifically pick a color I know strikes a little bit fast, but also one I don't think I've done like on Twisted Skeins by itself or first in a while. So again, things may not work out exactly the way I have planned, but I didn't want to do the blue again because I did the blue for another project in another video that maybe has come out or will be coming out soon. So a bit of a long introduction, but let's talk about our yarn. Today we're going to be dyeing Knit Picks Stroll fingering weight yarn. This yarn is 75% superwash merino wool, 25% nylon, and I am twisting it. I'm not counting the number of twists. We're going to start with the yarn dry. And we're going to use 300 grams. This is one of my favorite yarn bases in the whole world. I am a Knit Picks affiliate, so if you'd like to learn more about the yarn base, I have affiliate links down in the video description, and I will earn a commission if you make a purchase through one of my links. But anyway, let's go talk about the color that we're going to use today. For our color today, we're going to use Dharma's Deep Magenta. I picked this color because it can strike really quickly to yarn. And so therefore, we should still be able to maintain some high contrast in our yarn. And that's what I want for starting with. We want it to go low contrast later, not at the beginning. This is a 1% stock solution, which means there's 1 gram of dye dissolved in 100 milliliters of liquid. Now, Deep Magenta is not as soluble as other colors, so this is one that you need to shake super well to get everything that it might settle down to the bottom suspended. And so therefore, I'm planning on measuring out the dye for both of, I guess, both rounds when I'm planning to add color all at once. Now I'm going to measure out a 1/4 cup or approximately 60 milliliters of our dye twice. And actually I realize now it doesn't matter if the proportions are even or equal or anything because there will probably be some dye left over from the first round of dyeing it. I just want to make sure that there's enough pigment for the second round. Maybe it'll be too much. Who knows? Maybe we'll have to do round 3. But here's just one more look at my twisted skeins. They're not perfectly twisted. It's a little wonky, but you know, the thing with dyeing tonal yarn is sometimes you don't know exactly how the placement will go, but I'm really excited to have the dimension of more patches of darker and lighter color in the yarn. One last thing I want to do is add zip ties onto the yarn. This means when I untwist it, I'll have something on there already to hold on to, especially if the yarn is really, really hot. So then we can add that back in. There we go. I suppose I could have added these on later, but if the yarn's really hot, this will just help. This very hot dye bath was just at a boil. It had 24 cups of water, and I'm going to add 6 tablespoons of white vinegar. 4, 5, 6. And I'm going to add 60 milliliters of that dye we measured out, and I will rinse out this cup. And I'm trying to work quickly because the dye bath is not currently on the heat, but we are nice and hot. Okay, now I'm still planning on working with dry yarn today. And so we're gonna add in our 3 twisted skeins. Let it sink in, and this might pull some dye through. You can see all the bubbles. Oh, that's so funny, of the air going in. Oh, that's so pretty. All right, and I think, goodness, I'll take this back over to the heat and I'll check in on it after 5 minutes. It has been 5 minutes and you can see a little bit of our contrast. All right, our dye does seem to be clearing a bit, but I will go ahead and leave the yarn in here for another 5 minutes before we go ahead and remove it. It has now been 10 minutes and almost all of our color has absorbed into our yarn, which is great. And you can see as I lift it up, little bits of that resist. Now we do have tonal darker pinks and lighter pinks even within here, like there's a very deep pink there, but what is left in the dye bath is really, really pastel. So I'm gonna take the rest of our pink dye, put that in, rinse out our cup. All right, I'm gonna take this back to the stove so we can stay hot. Okay, here we go. And now with the help of my tongs, we are gonna untwist the yarn, and you can see this high contrast that we have in here. Oh my goodness, we did it. We did it. I think I'm gonna wanna remove some of the liquid from here just so that way I can show you guys a little better the patterning. But you can see that we've got our patches of color and light interrupted. There's some really big sections of white. There's a lot of variation in here. I'll be right back. Okay, there's a lot less liquid in here now. And so now if I show you a skein, you can see the inside and the outside has this sort of striping almost pattern. Now the nice thing about these skeins from Knit Picks is that if you dye something completely asymmetric, there will be some variation in how things blend together when you knit with it, because the yarn sort of isn't all, it's not like a gradient from one end of the skein to the other. And so that variation is totally fine. But you can see now we have something that is really high contrast. We have super dark areas and super light areas. And so if we want something that is tonal, that maybe it wouldn't work with complex stitch patterns, we'll see how much contrast we end up with. But you can over dye with the same color to reduce the contrast. And so that is our plan exactly. Our dye bath is quite warm, and I'm gonna wanna take our yarn and I'm gonna wanna quickly go into the dye bath. This is a color that strikes fast. Oh dear. Raise and lower, because I don't want there to be a lot of white left behind. Now, deep magenta, I don't believe is a color that results in back staining, where if you have that color and put it in hot water, the color will bleed out and then it can be soaked up by other colors on our yarn. But oh my gosh, there are some elements of this that already are just looking stunning. Now, we have almost absorbed all of this color here, and I love it. I love how we have something that has still contrast, but is way, way, way more subtle than it was. We could take this a step further. There is some yarn here that is still light, but I don't want to fix what isn't broken because I want to lean with this. And let's step in front of the camera and talk a little bit about what we could do differently while I go and I heat this for 30 minutes. One thing we definitely could have done would have been to let our yarn cool off completely, start with a cold dye bath, rinse the yarn to remove acid, to then get more even coverage of our color on the yarn. Because you saw just how quickly we soaked up all of that dye. But if you wanted to just use the same dye bath and do things hot, another thing you could do is layer on your color in multiple steps. So I could have divided the dye that we have into 3 and layered it on, let the yarn soak up the color, bring the yarn back out, add more dye, shift the zip tie, and do this again. I think I have a video where I created a tonal pastel color by layering the color on multiple times, because otherwise the dye would strike so quickly to the yarn, it wouldn't give sort of all over depth and dimension that I was going for. So could I take the colorway that we have here and add more dye? Absolutely. But I like the idea of having the same amount of dye on each step, even though there was a little bit left before we added in our untwisted yarn. And I'm excited to see what this yarn is going to look like dry. So that way, again, we can think about, okay, how might we shift and modify this moving forward? Because if I modify it now, then future Rebecca may not remember quite where we ended up and how we got there. But I always like to, I don't know, I think of it like the discussion section of a paper. And I'm like, great, this is the result we got. How do we build on this? Why did we get what we got? And I don't know, I enjoy that part of thinking about how to move forward. But I will say I am so happy with where we are. And honestly, you don't have to over dye with the same color. You could do a different color. You have a lot of possibility, but doing a tonal layer over something more variegated is a way to sort of even things out a little bit and make that contrast softer overall, even if there is still contrast. Let's remove our yarn, which, you know, at first glance is looking very pink. You can see we do have that lighter area I spoke of. But overall, we still have some contrast because of that. But I think we've reduced the contrast by a lot. And so I'm going to set our yarn aside to cool and we'll wash it. Let's wash our pretty pink yarn. Oh, so pretty. And I think that this could also be helpful for sometimes when you might want a lot of dimension in your colorway, but don't want something that's dip dyed. Because when you dip dye yarn, and I just added a little bit of soap onto our completely cool yarn and cool water, when you dip dye yarn, you'll end up with more saturated color. At one end, it'll get lighter and lighter. But a downside to that is then you'll get a yarn that can give you micro stripes or a lot of pooling. This gives you something that may still pool, but with shorter sections of color difference, you're more likely to get a lot of blending, which I know I personally like. And I don't know why I haven't done this more often when I'm going for something that is very monochromatic and tonal. I'm more likely to add yarn into a crowded spot and just see what happens. This gives a little bit more control, although we did get some very saturated spots from our twist at the beginning. But anyway, I'm going to pop this through my spin dryer, hang it up to dry, and we'll take a look at the finished yarn. We still have a lot of contrast in this tonal yarn. There's some areas that are very saturated, and then some areas that are very pastel. I think this skein has a few more. Deep magenta is a color that soaks into the yarn so quickly that I could have done 2 layers because it soaked up like within a minute. And so the reason why we have some lighter patches is if that yarn was in the middle of our bundle as we're going in, that provided some amount of resist. But what I really like about this yarn is that the color sections are short. And so yes, we have this longer section of color here. We have like a longer section of that medium pink. But if I were to have just dip dyed, we wouldn't have as much variation in here. And so this is going to give something with slightly less pooling, a little more randomness to it. And I love it. But you go ahead and let me know down in the comment section if you would have over dyed this one more time to even out the color even more. My whole purpose with this video was to show an easy way that you can create a monochromatic tonal yarn, but then reduce the contrast if you want. And again, you can go a step further from what we have here, but this is just a starting point. If we wanted to reduce the contrast even more, I would decrease the amount of dye for the first twist with our resist layer and increase the amount of dye from when we have everything untwisted. Now, why did I go for our resist first and then over dye it after? Well, that gives a little bit more of a demonstration of the high contrast versus lower contrast, but you definitely could dye your tonal layer first, then twist up the yarn and over dye it. It's a lot easier to twist up cold yarn than it is to twist up warm, hot yarn. So time-wise, it's probably faster to start with the yarn twisted and then over dye it. It's also a little easier to gauge the amount of color we want with the next layer. If we start with the contrast and then we're adding the yarn into more dye, we don't have to absorb all the dye. We can always like remove the yarn at some point. So I guess my preference would be to start with twisted, but again, you let me know if you would prefer to do it the opposite way. Or if you want me to do it the opposite way and create a video on that. This yarn is an example of yarn I would call tonal, that no one would look at and say, oh, that's a semi-solid. Because we still have a fair amount of contrast in here. For something to be, like, it's hard to dye a true solid yarn when you're hand dyeing yarn. There's always going to be a tiny bit of variation in there. You can get something pretty close, but the imperfection and variability is part of what makes hand dyed yarn so special and unique and beautiful and fun. But there are yarns that can be tonal and semi-solid, and I would say to get there we would need to reduce this contrast a lot more. And so I would say that semi-solid yarns can fit within the umbrella of tonals, but not all tonal yarns I would classify as semi-solid, if that makes sense. But that's at least the way I would define yarn as I list things in the ChemKnits Creations Etsy shop. Which, by the way, if you love the yarn I dye, go and check out my shop to bring home some hand-dyed yarn that's been featured in one of my videos. This pink is making me so happy. Oh my goodness. I love monochromatic yarns. This one might still be a little too contrasty for like a complex lace pattern, but it's not as busy as some other yarns I create. And so I think that it is way more versatile than some more of the wild colorways that I dye sometimes. But anyway, subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new video. I am Rebecca from ChemKnits, and thank you so much for watching.